morning and good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, I'm immensely grateful to Ricardo and the organizers for the opportunity to share this session. But let me to introduce you the prestigious keynote speaker of the underlying session, Professor Shrinivas Katkoori, who is going to talk about behavioral and RT level synthesis of secure hardware. Dr. Katkoori is a faculty member at the University of South Florida, and his research group has been conducting research on related topics such as low-power digital VLSI design, reliable systems design, IoT, smart embedded systems, transportation, healthcare, among others. Dr. Katkoori has already supervised 15 doctor dissertations and has published over than 125 journal and conference papers, of each 3 were nominated for Best Paper Awards in high-level conferences such as ASPDAC and VLSI SOC. Dr. Katkoori also served as associate editor of IEEE transactions on VLSI from 2006 to 2010, and has acted as well as general chair of IFIP IoT conference. So, Professor Katkoori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luciano. Thanks for. So, I would like to thank Professor Ricardo Rice and organizers for inviting me to give this talk. And I really am very impressed by the initiative that's taken by IEEE CAS Rio Grande do Sul. I also have attended other talks which are conducted besides this workshop. So they're excellent, excellent talks, and I really am learning a lot. And it's my honor and privilege to be here today to give a talk on secure hardware. So, so greetings, everyone. So first, what we'll do is we will look at. So before I start, so this research that I'm going to discuss today is the doctoral. This is the doctoral research of my student who just defended and joined the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. Dr. Sheikh Ariful Islam, so is a former PhD student, and so really this work here is the dissertation work of Arif. So first, let's look at the agenda. So we will introduce the problem and we'll motivate the problem, and then we'll look at what is the scope of this talk. So we'll present 3 ideas, 3 research ideas that we have successfully demonstrated, and to show how you can secure hardware and also automate it. And then we'll draw conclusions and future directions. So introduction. So hardware is everywhere, as you know, right? So in this picture, you can see that the hardware is used, in healthcare, in industry environment, in oil, and work, etc., aviation, and so on. So hardware is everywhere. And this design of hardware or electronic supply chain has, changed the way it's being designed. Okay, so as you know now, the integrated circuits are no longer designed by just one company, but rather it is a global effort right now, right? So, you have you perhaps have the design, specifications happening in probably Silicon Valley, and then some of the design happening in Silicon Valley, and then it's outsourced, maybe design in in India and Taiwan and so on, and then the fabrication could happen in Taiwan, testing could happen in another country, and so on. So What this means is that the electronics supply chain, has no borders anymore. So this is a global effort. And while this is great that we now have a global market, that also brings us with some issues, right? So what that is that this design is now exposed to many players, and then potentially some of them could be malicious players. So for example, like in 2005, US military has said that it has found in its systems about $300 million worth fake components. And in 2015, it is estimated that the counterfeit sales are about $1.5 trillion. Okay. And then there is also this problem of recycled components, where old components are refurbished and put it in new packages and remarked as though they are new. And clearly, we just had a talk about failures, and the failures obviously occur more as the devices age. So this is also a big problem. So the hardware-based vulnerabilities, there are several reported just in last year. Cisco router, bug had massive global implications. Microsoft confirms there is a Windows CPU-based attack vulnerability, and Android, alert has alerted to a critical flaw in Qualcomm Snapdragon chips, and so on. So many of these problems are related to hardware, right? So what's the attack surface in IC design flow? So we are familiar with this standard design flow, where you start with specification, which is high level spec, and you generate RTL design, and then you continue with gate level synthesis, physical layout, and fabrication, and so on. So if somebody wants to do something malicious, what are the things that they can do at these levels, right? So at the so here on the left, you see what are possible things that could be done. At RTL design level, one could tamper the design, and at the RTL design, it is now only a netlist, a soft netlist that could be tampered easily, right? You could insert hardware trojans to steal information later on when the IC is produced. You could so on and so forth. So at the fabrication level, one could do overproduction, and so that's actually denying the rightful owner of their profit, right? So on and so forth. So pre-deployment, also you can do things to the design. Post-deployment, you can do counterfeiting, you can do recycling, you can remark and resell, you can reverse engineer, to figure out, what the design does, and probably then exploit any, any backdoors or loopholes or bugs. So three major problems that we can identify are the counterfeiting via reverse engineering, the hardware Trojan via parts modification, and then also violate the integrity of the design in the sense that it's supposed to do something, and now you are adding something malicious, and so therefore you are introducing some extra behavior into the design which is not intended to be. So what are the countermeasures? So the IC security design has been like it has been on forefront, in last 10 years, 15 years. There has been this problem has been recognized, and now there are thousands of researchers across the world addressing these problems. Okay? And what we see is that at the lower levels, which is the gate level and the physical layout level, there are several techniques that have been proposed. For example, watermarking, logic locking, and camouflaging the design so that it's hard to break, so on. So at the higher levels, like RT level, there are some work like mode-based finite state machine and so on. However, what we see is that there is not much work done at higher levels, that is at the RT level and the behavior level. So what can we do? For example, we can use testing-based solutions, perhaps like use statistical modeling. So let's say we want to see if there is any hardware Trojan, in the design, and if we can actually certify maybe a design doesn't have hardware Trojans or anything malicious. One could use testing-based solutions, where you could probably use statistical modeling, based on the input streams. You can perform testing, right? You can perform verification, right? You can also do probabilistic modeling, where you could propagate the signal probabilities and try to find nets that are being used in the design. So what is missing is that we find that input correlation based early detection framework is missing. So the problem is we want to say, are there any hardware Trojans in the design? And so far, the solutions that exist are not haven't taken input correlations into account. So therefore, now of course, like the hardware is supposed to be trusted, right? So things like you could do instruction set architecture extension and so on and so forth. So what is missing is that the integrity of the underlying hardware IP. So according to NIST, you want to automate as much as possible so that you can reduce validation cycle and the cost, and perhaps do just-in-time security validation. So what are the key requirements of hardware security? Right. So we want transparency, compatibility, and resilience. So the first, so some of the common myths in software security is that security can be provided only through software, and the hardware is root of trust. Okay, but unfortunately, hardware is no longer secure in the sense that it could be attacked, and there are many instances. So the benefits to push security down to hardware is that you can possibly, it's harder for somebody to attack the system compared to software, right? And however, the downside is that hardware is heterogeneous, and we can't quite patch hardware just like we can do with the software. Okay, so here at a high level view, we are going to talk about these three techniques that we have successfully proposed. The first idea is that we can obfuscate the design so that we can protect the design from unauthorized users to be able to use it or reverse engineer. The second idea is that we want to be able to automate the process of identifying potentially if there are any hardware Trojans in the design. And then lastly, to be able to protect the controller in the design, right? So so that we have a control flow integrity, right? So that what that means is that the design, the control flow can so you're not executing the design. So you have data path and control. The control has control flow graph, which provides the legal paths, right, through control flow graph. So whenever somebody wants to attack a design, they can violate this control flow of the design. So how can you protect the control flow? So those are the three ideas, and hopefully I'll be able to give you an overview of each of these, so that you can appreciate how we can protect designs at high level. So first is the RTL design protection through behavioral synthesis, right? So so the assumptions are that the attacker has access to the locked netlist and an Oracle black box IC, which can tell you, whether your output is correct or not. So here what we see on the top is that you see a flow where the earlier part of the design flow is assumed to be trusted, but after RTL, we assume that it is in untrusted design regime. That is the logic synthesis, layout synthesis, and fabrication. These steps are being done in untrusted design regime. So the goals here are to increase the reverse engineering complexity. So make it harder for the attacker to reverse engineer, and also reduce potentially unsafe uses. And importantly, we don't want to save the key, in a external memory. So when we are going to lock the design, right? So there is a key to unlock it. This key should not be stored anywhere, so that if it is stored, then possibly the attacker can reverse engineer the key, and then he has the design. So the idea here is that we want to be able to lock it, but the key is not, it's harder to reverse engineer, and it is not stored within the design anywhere. Okay, so here what we show is that we have a high-level synthesis tool where you are taking a program specification, and through this high-level synthesis process, we want to automatically obfuscate the design. So in other words, introduce this extra hardware so that locks the design. So here is a simple example. We have a data flow graph, and that is being synthesized into an RTL design. RTL design has these multiplexers, registers, and functional units. Okay. So how do I obfuscate? So obfuscation is done by introducing these multiplexers, in the structural netlist where. So for example, here, if you see, this multiplexer, actually the R3 is supposed to get, so if you go back, R3 is supposed to get E, that is the correct input, right? So what we are going to do is, now we introduce a multiplexer and we take some random signal within the design, and then have that as a possible input. Now only when key bit is 0, you are getting the correct input, and if it is 1, you are going to get some incorrect input, and the design obviously is incorrect. Okay, so like this, here we have introduced 3 multiplexers combining the correct signals and some randomly selected signals. Okay, so here we are. I mean, these are the dotted paths are basically potential obfuscation points along the edge. Okay, so So the obfuscated function then looks something like this, where you have these key bits, and when the key bits are correct, then you have the correct design. So in other words, you need a key for this design to operate correctly. So here is another architecture where we have introduced the obfuscation multiplexers. So we automated this process. We have so the high level idea here is that that we want to introduce the multiplexers on non-critical path, because if we introduce this hardware, then it is going to worsen the performance of the design. So what we want to do is we want to introduce the multiplexers on non-critical paths. So therefore, the idea here is that when we are obfuscating, we are looking at nodes or edges which have some slack, right? Timing slack, and so that's where we are going to introduce the hardware. So it's a very simple idea. Okay, so here is the algorithm that where that obfuscates the RTL netlist. So where we are this is performing during the scheduling. So in order to find the slack, we have to perform ASAP AP algorithm, and depending on that, the mobility. And once you have the mobility, then mobilities, then non-zero, the ones which have non-zero mobilities will be collected, and then based on each operation, we are going to introduce the multiplexers. Okay, so now how do we analyze? So any security that we are going to introduce in a design, we want to make sure that it cannot be easily broken. Okay, so what is the resilience, like what is the withstanding capability, and what is the potency of this technique? That obviously the harder the design, the harder the hacker would have to attack the design. And then what is the cost, right? We don't want to really pay too much cost for the security, because our design security is really a secondary thing, right? So we don't want to have too much overhead. Okay, so in terms of resilience, we have here we compute the probability of guessing a bit, right, a key bit. And so this formula actually gives you what is the probability that you can actually break this design or break the key. Okay, so what the way we validate it is that we have an in-house high-level synthesis tool called Audi, and we have modified that tool to automatically incorporate obfuscation, and then put that design through Synopsys design compiler for 90 nanometer technology node. So we evaluated this for 4 data path intensive designs and 1 crypto core. Okay, so here what we see is that what are the design overheads, right? So we actually, by the way, we have tried different key lengths, like 32-bit, 64-bit, 128-bit. Clearly, the longer the key size is, the harder the design to break, right? So for 32-bit, for example, elliptic, these are the 4 TSP designs, and then you have the crypto. We see that the area delay and power overheads are reasonable, right? So less than 2%, 3%. So these are reasonable overheads. So as we increase the key bit, 32, 64, and 128 key bits, we see that these are reasonable overheads. And what is the probability of breaking a key, an obfuscation key? So we have evaluated, depending on the number of registers we have and number of the IO bits, we have these probabilities which are like extremely low. Okay? And of course, as the key size increases, you see that the probability is extremely low, to the power of minus 383, for example, right? So with this, is your IP secure? Okay, is it secure yet? So now if the attacker knows that it is obfuscated, what they can do is they can actually try a brute force technique where they can try many different keys, and perhaps you can even do like a SAT based attack where you can predict the keys. Okay, so clearly this is a problem, right? So we have raised the bar, but still not enough. So our next idea extension of this is that we can we actually lock the design, after some finite but incorrect attempts, right? So we are familiar with the software. For example, you have a software, and you enter your password 3 times or 4 times, and then after that it locks out. It says that okay, you cannot try your password anymore. Okay, this we are very familiar. This is very common in software world. But in hardware world, this is not common. It is not tried yet. And so therefore, for hardware security, we have tried this idea where the design, keeps track of how many attempts have been made. And if the attempts are too many, then, incorrect attempts are too many, it will simply lock the design. It will not execute anymore. So in other words, the outputs are no longer observable. Okay, everything will be zeroed out. Okay, so this is the idea that we have experimented. So the idea here is that you have this data path with all these obfuscating multiplexers, and then you have your FSM, which is going to be a obfuscated FSM. So what we want to do is we want to lock out these two, and so therefore clearly we need some logic to see, okay, how many times the user actually has entered incorrect key. Okay. So here is the additional hardware that is added to this your standard data path control design, where what you do is now you are going to have a checker finite state machine that is going to keep track of like how many times this is being wrong key is being entered. Okay, and if wrong key has been entered, depending on some threshold count, okay, and that count can be set by the designer. And if that happens, then essentially the controller is going to go into a black hole kind of a state where it cannot it now needs like an authorized another master key to come out. Okay? So here we show like how there is a partial lockout that can happen when the user is going to try unsuccessfully like several attempts. Okay, so it goes into like a black hole state where it in order to come out, you now need another way to do this. So clearly, if the regular inputs are all are not being processed, how do we come out of this lockout? So maybe an authorized user has been locked out. Okay, so now just like your software, you might need the owner would send you another key that you can try, and so on and so forth. So here what we do is that we have this testable logic, right? So we have testable logic where that the scan chain, right? You can have a scan chain mode. So what we do is we piggyback on the test mode, the scan chain mode, to enter your master key. Okay. So this shows like the flow where how we are going to integrate the de-lockout. So we call this the de-lockout or design lockout. So how it is integrated with existing design. So again, we have done analysis of, okay, if this is the case, how can you, what is the probability of the key extraction, for de-lockout? And so I will not go into the math here, but what we see is that, for 32-bit and 128-bit and so on, the probability is going to increase quite a bit, and it's much harder to break the locked out design. So what is the design overhead? So if you look at the design overhead for this lockout hardware, extra hardware, what we see is that it's reasonable. Okay? It's reasonable, like less than area and delay are less than like 5%. For some designs we see that the overhead is high, right? For lattice and so on, but it depends on the design. So the previous slide showed the results for the best case. So we have tried this, evaluated this design for like the best case, typical, and worst case design corners. So that's what we have here. So for example, worst case corner, what we see is that the power overhead is actually less than like about 8%. Although delay actually overhead has increased. So depends on the design corner. So can we do better? Okay, now that you have design lockout, can the designer attacker can actually reverse engineer the multiplexers? So our solution here is that let's use a camouflaged multiplexers, okay, that are going to be now further offer like other modes which will confuse the designer. So if somebody was going to look at a multiplexer and try to find out, okay, this is a obfuscation multiplexer, but the multiplexer itself now is not a mux anymore, but it has several different functions, and those functions now further are controlled by this configuration bit. So unless the configuration bit is provided, that multiplexer, what it does, we do not know. So gradually what we have done is we have raised the difficulty level, right? So first we obfuscated, then we have introduced lockout, and then we have camouflaged the multiplexers. So I will not go into this in the interest of time. So we'll move on to the next idea. So this is the algorithm used to identify multiplexers and so on. Okay, and also the design overheads are reasonable. Okay. We also analyzed for differential power analysis attack, because power analysis can be done to reverse engineer and so on. And what we show is that it's hard to do with DP attack as well. So there are publications on these ideas, and recently we have a Todious paper coming out on this, which is already out. So if you're interested, you can look at this paper. So the next idea that we are going to share is that we want to analyze a design, right, at RT level to see if there is any hardware Trojan, or is it vulnerable for hardware Trojan insertion. Okay? So so again, here we assume your trusted zone and your untrusted zone. Okay. So first, what we actually have done is we have just through simulation analyzed whether whether library modules like adders or adders or multipliers, how does the architecture, the type of adder or multiplier, does that make that design vulnerable for hardware Trojan insertion. So that is the problem. Okay, so what we have done is we have simulated the modules, different module architectures, right? And we have analyzed and found like, okay, how many nets? So the assumption here is that the number of the nets that are going to be used in a hardware Trojan, usually these are low with a very low probability, low switching probability nets, so that the hardware Trojan is not easily detectable. Now, what we have seen is that we need to take the spatio-temporal correlation into account. Just random vectors is not sufficient, and this we know from low power design. If you have looked at low power design, correlated inputs have to be used, and random vectors are not enough. So we need to do both temporal and spatial correlation. This shows like how we have generated the vectors, and then we have looked at like activity. Okay, and then we have compared the different module architectures. So these are the module architectures that we have looked at for the adder, like ripple carry adder, carry look ahead, etc. In a Kogi stone adder, and so on. And then for multipliers, we looked at array multiplier, data, booth, and Vedic multiplier. So the question here is that does the architecture itself is vulnerable to hardware Trojans? Okay, like an adder is an adder, but how you are going to design, will that make that particular module vulnerable, are some more vulnerable to hardware Trojan insertion compared to others? That's the question. And interestingly, we did find that that is the case. So here we have looked at like different threshold toggle counts, right? So, and what we see is that for example, like ripple carry adder, the number of toggle nets is much less compared to, like, let's say carry save adder, right? And of course, these three are like for different types of data that are being processed. So this is only positive data, only negative numbers, negative to positive numbers, and so on. So out of these architectures, what we found is that the carry look ahead adder is probably the best. So what you see here is that, and assuming that you are using your regular numbers like both negative and positive in 2's complement format, then so what we found is that the carry look ahead adder actually has very low number of low activity nets. Okay, and that is good, right? Because that way what we can do is if we are looking for hardware Trojans, we can look at these nets and see if somebody has used them to create a Trojan. Okay, so depending on the activity region across your world, again what we find is that carry look at adder is a very good adder to be used if you want to avoid hardware Trojans. Okay, this kind of shows in terms of your power performance and area, right? So that is so we find that is that's for the adder. Now let's look at the multiplier. So for multiplier, what we find is that data adder is actually, data multiplier is actually a better architecture compared to others. It is less prone to hardware Trojan insertion. Okay, so this we did for 8-bit, 16-bit, and so on. Okay, so next is that the simulation is good, but it is time intensive. So therefore, how about we can actually estimate? Okay, so based on the word level statistics, can we estimate the number of nets which are low toggle nets, And if we can do this, then this can be done very rapidly, right? Because then we can compare many different designs without simulation. So what we have done is here we have used the prior work from Landman and Rabe from Berkeley. This work was developed for power estimation, in power estimation at RT level and behavioral level. So we leverage that idea for hardware Trojan estimation. Okay. So briefly, what it is that for any given input data stream or statistics, the region, the word level region can be broken into like 3 regions. One is your lower bits, which behave like a uniform white noise. Then in between, they are like the transition bits, and then your sign bits, which have very low probability of changing. Okay. So therefore we actually can evaluate a design based on the environment in which it's going to be operating. Okay, so this is the math. I'm not going to go through the math. This paper actually was published in ISQD this year, and if you're interested, you can find this, these details in that paper. Okay, again, the same, how to determine the breakpoints depending on the data statistics is what is shown here. So we have now this analytical approach, which is much faster than the simulation-based approach. So what we did was we compared this analytical approach with the simulation-based approach and see that whether, what is the error. Okay, obviously we want low error so that analytical approach can be used to evaluate an architecture. Okay, so here, like this shows a design where it actually identifies that like the cells and the nets which are below some triggering threshold. Okay, so just to show that we can actually pinpoint the nets in your layout, where exactly potentially there could be Trojan inserted. Okay, so this shows the errors, like error percentage in terms of estimation for different adders and multipliers, right? So what we see is that the errors are fairly low, and what we see is that the errors are like here for 8-bit adder, it's less than 1%. So which means that it's as good as evaluating it in simulation with generating your data streams and so on. Even for multiplier, the same thing. Okay, so now how to use this technique to evaluate an RTL design? So what we can do is, given a design, okay, so an RTL design, we can propagate the input statistics through this. And once you propagate these, then you can, so this propagation actually was already developed earlier for low power design. Okay, so this is a known technique. So once we propagate now for each module instance, we have specific input statistics that can be used to determine if there is a Trojan that could be inserted in that block. Okay, so we have again have done this for your DSP course and for crypto design and so on. Okay, so for these designs, then we have seen that well, does this actually estimate properly for for the entire design? And we do see that the error is really very low, less than 1%. So which means that this technique actually works very well to evaluate the RTL design. Okay, so So these are the papers that are published on this idea, and the Journal of Hardware and Systems Security HAS journal, we have this paper published. So interested folks can look at that paper. So lastly, the control flow integrity is the third technique that we have proposed. And so I just want to see, should I stop here for questions, or should I continue?
I believe you can continue.
Okay, all right. So maybe I'll try to wrap up in like 10 minutes then.
Please,
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the control flow integrity is where, so again, here we are showing the attack model. The attack model is that, you are trusted regime until high level synthesis, and then later you could be attacked. So the attack could be through state injection. So in other words, somebody could create new states or create new edges between states, right? Or it could be through a data injection attack. That is, you can put arbitrary input via PIs, right? Primary inputs for arbitrary transitions. So the goal is to transparently monitor the program behavior, and then when a CFI violation or control flow integrity violation occurs, then you raise a flag. Okay, so really the objective is to identify reachable, unreachable state transitions, and then we, as the machine, so this is really a runtime detection of control flow violation. Okay, so so here we'll demonstrate this with a simple example. Like, let's say you have this traffic light controller which has a state diagram that is shown here, and the black state transition edges are legal edges, and the red ones are illegal edges. So in other words, for example, like this is a traffic light controller. This is supposed to loop through the three lights, right? Red, green, and yellow, right? So for example, if it goes from green to green, directly, from a highway to farm way, right? So that is actually, that will be fatal, right? So things like this. So these are like incorrect transitions. That is, these are control flow violations that can happen. So how do we actually address this problem? What we do is we actually look at this state transition matrix, and the green ones here are your legal ones, and the red ones are illegal ones. So what we do is that we create an expression, a valid transitions expression, so here this expression is actually giving you what are all the legal transitions. Okay, so now that is going to be implemented as a monitor. Okay, so it is going to be implemented as a monitor, and here we are just showing the VHDL code of how it is being modified. So this monitor is what is going to be during the runtime. It's going to say, okay, so this is the current state, and this is the next state that the controller is saying it will go to, right? So now what the monitor can do is it's going to basically check that whether that is a valid transition or not. If it is not a valid transition, it's going to halt the controller. Okay, so what the attack scenarios could be, that there could be within the process it could be attacked, right, within the design, or it could be like intra process, where you have attacks coming from two different processes. Okay, so this shows like how we take the RTL design, and typically if you are doing high level synthesis, you don't need to extract the CFG because it's there already as a behavioral controller. But if you are looking at another RTL design, so what this shows is that this technique is applicable for other RTL designs, where you can extract the CFG, and then based on that you can construct the monitor. And then once you construct the monitor, you instrument the controller with this monitor for runtime check of control flow violations. Okay, so there are three policies that this runtime security is going to implement, right? So one is, states can't be altered. So in other words, you cannot add or delete a state. And transition between states can be modified. So in other words, that you are not you are not deleting any legal legal edges or introducing new new transition edges. And lastly, you execute only valid input values. Okay. So in the software world, actually control flow violations can happen through invalid inputs. And one of the notorious ones is buffer overflow attacks, where you can overflow and change the return addresses. So here we are kind of saying that execute only on valid input values. Okay. So this shows like how you can construct the policy based on the state encoding. Okay. And this shows the architecture where you have your standard data path controller and then the monitor. That monitor is going to look at look at your current state and the next state. And so essentially these are it's taking the current state and the next state, and then it's checking whether there's a valid transition or not. Okay, so this kind of shows like, so this is a verifier that is verifying that it's a valid state transition or not. Okay. This shows your code instrumented controller, how you can embed and embed this monitor and so on. So by the way, this can be completely automated, and so therefore the user doesn't have to really worry about looking into this. Based on the state machine, this can be automatically done. So this kind of shows. So we have evaluated this for 7 different designs, digital system, the DSP filters, and also we evaluated this at 3 design corners. And so here what we see is that these are the overheads for the best case corner. And what again we see is that the area, delay, and power overheads are again reasonable, right? Which is less than 3% or 4%. So this shows like again a fine grained. So we can do actually a coarse grained, or we can do fine grained. So fine grained is that so coarse grained is where you can actually find some critical state transitions and check for them, whereas fine grained is you can do for all the possible edges, all possible states and all possible edges. Okay. Again, here what we see is that the overheads are higher than coarse grained, but still reasonable. Okay. And this shows like your the monitor area in terms of the layout. We implemented this in a 90 nanometer technology, and what is the power in microwatts and area in square micron. Again, this work has recently appeared in ISVLSI. This paper is now in IEEE Explore. So to end, so the conclusions are that we can protect RTL IP, through obfuscation and design lockout and camouflaging, and we have shown this 3 levels of protection at RT level, and all this can be automated. Then next is what we have shown is we have developed a framework to analyze a design, whether it is prone for hardware trojans. And if it is prone for hardware trojans, we can actually pinpoint where potentially there could be hardware trojans, okay, at the layout level. And then lastly, what is the we can protect the controller itself, from illegal control flow. That is, the control flow violations can be detected during the runtime with very reasonable overhead. So these are all the publications on these ideas, and there are a couple of provisional patents that are being under consideration. So that's all I have, and if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening speech. So let's move straight forward to the questions. So far there is no one, so I'm gonna make my questions here, okay?
Sure, thanks.
So my first question is related to your analytical model approach. Let's say you have mentioned that it's quite consistent when compared to the simulation approach.
Correct.
My question is, does that vary? Like, I would say the difference or the error when you change the design type. That I might guess that depending on the nature of your design, that difference might either increase or decrease. Am I wrong?
That you are correct. Actually, so what it is that if the design has less correlation, right? Then there you will do better. If there is much more correlation, then your errors will be high. Your estimation errors will be high. Correct. So any design, things we already know, things like reconvergent fan out is going to introduce more correlations, right? A design with a lot more reconvergent fan out, their errors would be higher. Yes, but still, what we found is that in the real designs, it's only like less than 1-2%, so which is reasonable.
Totally.
Yes.
Oh, thank you for that. So I have, there is a question here from Ricardo Reis.
Yes.
So for security, which design method you consider more effective?
So it depends on what your goal is. Like, for example, like the first technique that we talked about is that, this is basically obfuscating the design. So in other words, if your design is going to be, available to many people, right, many end users or designers, because we are the first one is really we're talking about IP. The IP reuse is very common now. So if you want to protect your IP, right, from reverse engineering and either reusing it, illegally or introducing something, right? So then this will be good. But the other one is that this one is that let's say I already have a design and I know the architecture, I know my design in and out, right? And somebody has designed it, so I sent it for fabrication. It comes back. Now I want to know if something malicious has been inserted. So in that case, then this will be very useful, right? So hardware Trojan localization. And then lastly here, the control flow, the third idea is again, depends on the, like, let's say if there's not much interaction with the user for the design, right? Then maybe you don't need that. But if there is a lot of interaction with the design, then you should probably try to do. And also, like, it also depends on criticality of the design. So if the design is like like earlier talk that Matthew talked about, critical systems, right? So if you are using the design in some critical systems like healthcare or aviation or automobile and so on, then this becomes important. But if it is something that is not, if it's just a computer, for example, and then it's not making critical decisions, maybe you can use this sparingly. Okay, so it depends on the design, it depends on the environment, depends on who could possibly attack. Okay,
I'm gonna use your part of your answer to link my other question.
sure.
Basically, as you mentioned, some critical systems they have some constraints, but some of those constraints are not only related to security but also to real-time constraints.
Correct.
How flexible is our approach? Can you somehow try to find a trade-off between how much hardware you are going to add and how much protection you'll be improving, but at the same time considering the real-time constraints that your system, your design might have?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So the question really is, if I were to rephrase, are these techniques, are they going to for example, runtime control flow violation, can it be used in real-time context? And I believe we can do so, because the thing is that this kind of runtime check, for example, is happening in parallel with the main function. Okay, and so one could so if you use high-level synthesis, the tools can actually also design. There are design flows for real-time system design with high-level synthesis. So if you integrate this in such a flow, then definitely it can be done.
Great.
So especially if you see earlier, like the overhead, area, power, and delay, they're not much. So
they're not much.
Yes. So
thank you very much. So I have two further questions here. The first one is from Ricardo Reis again, and he asks you to make some comments about physical design for security.
Yes. So physical design is something that has been explored quite a bit already, and of course, it doesn't mean that the problem is solved. The problem is still there. So at the physical design, for example, camouflaging is being used quite a bit. And then the tools themselves, like the physical design tools, for example, like let's say when we design a layout, like let's say standard cell based layout, usually there could be some kind of gaps, right, like white spaces, right? So those are the spaces potentially an attacker could introduce some malicious circuits, right? So therefore, like there are design flows that actually take care of those white spaces so that they cannot be used, right? So at the physical design level, quite a bit of work is done, and but however, this is a lot more to be done. The problem at the physical design is the complexity is very high, right? If you're talking about billion transistor design, or like let's say billion gate design, and a malicious circuit doesn't have to be very big, like 4 gates or 5 gates is enough to create a malicious circuit. So if you're looking at like a billion gate design and only 4 or 5 gates are having this, can do this damage, how do you find it? It's a very difficult problem because of the VLSI design complexity.
Thank you one more time. So we still have time for one further and final question, I would say.
Right.
So the question comes from Professor José Azambuja. And he just wrote here that with foundries merging worldwide, what are your considerations on hardware security in the future?
So, in fact, it's a big concern already right now with foundries that are overseas, and the assumption in the security world right now, the hardware security world, is that you pretty much assume that your design will be attacked in the foundry. Okay, so because it is it's the whole process is actually is so complex, right? And so many players have access to the design and so on. So so the designers or the design companies can no longer take the word of the company that of the foundry that nothing malicious has been introduced. So that's why there's a lot of push from the US government, Department of Defense now, to actually develop tools to validate the design when it comes back. Okay, because they have already seen in critical things. For example, in a missile, they found a kill switch. Okay, they found a kill switch that could be remotely activated. Okay, so and there is also a talk of having a trusted foundry that's going to be built in US. I don't know how far it's there. At least there was an announcement in New York. There is going to be a trusted foundry, at least for the defense. They're going to try to see if they can have their own foundry. So the problem is very real and very serious. Okay, and although like the fabless model really has done wonders, because now there are many companies, but for fabrication they can do everything. But because this fabrication is done outside, and we are like, everybody is using that foundry, right? So therefore therefore a possibility of it being exposed to many different players is very high. Okay, but it's a very difficult question. It's a probably $1 billion or $1 trillion question. Because and in the security world, in design security world, in hardware security world, nobody is taking the foundry to be safe. Okay, even though so it's like kind of as one of the US presidents said, trust but verify. So you trust that, okay, the design is good, but still you verify with your own internal tools.
So thank you very much for the quite interesting talk again.
Sure,
and I believe that we can finish here now, right?